The MV Agusta F3. It's a beautiful middleweight sport bike with an 800cc inline 3-cylinder engine that spins backwards so that it's easier to lean into a corner.
According to MV, it's a street-legal racetrack legend, even if they do say so themselves. It was also my dream bike when I was 19. Well, this was my unrealistic dream bike, while the Yamaha R6 was my attainable dream bike.
But of course, it's an MV Agusta, so it has quite a few quirks. So the question is, do the pros outweigh the quirks?
To find out, I get to spend the next 127 hours with this gorgeous redhead.
It's going to be tough, but someone's got to do it. So this is where the F3 was supposed to be, but it broke down right after that intro. I'm just kidding, it's right here. But that is the stigma attached to MVs, right? And to be honest, the guys at MV Agusta Johannesburg seemed a little nervous about lending me this bike because they know I'm just gonna call out any of its shortcomings.
Well, time will tell. So this is the F3 Rosso, which is the base model and starts at around $19,000.
Pretty steep for a middleweight.
But I'm excited about this one, and I really want to like it. So thanks to MV Agusta Johannesburg for providing this machine. They have a beautiful showroom set up alongside Fast KTM. So if you're local and in the market for a new bike, used bike, in need of a workshop, or just some apparel and accessories, this is the perfect one-stop shop. Jumping on a new bike always makes you hyper aware of everything it's doing. So let's start with a few immediate quirks I noticed on my ride home. It's very eager. The throttle, the brakes, the handling, it all feels twitchy and ready to get going. It's little. Even I can flat-foot it with a slight bend in my knee at only 5'6". The mirrors would be just as useful if they were still at the MV Agusta factory in Italy. A very prominent induction noise arrives every time you crack the throttle that eggs you on. And I think the Flintstones method of braking would be more pleasant than using these Brembos, but I'll get to that in a minute.
Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way early on today.
Unreliability, parts are impossible to get, expensive.
We've all heard the typical MV Agusta stereotypes, and if any of those bother you, then this isn't the bike for you. But you should also look at the facts.
KTM recently acquired a majority stake in MV Agusta, and they're going to be in charge of their parts, which should help. And MVs are motorcycle art.
The person who should own an MV puts passion ahead of all of those stereotypes. In fact, you should own this bike for just two reasons: the way it rides and the way it looks.
The F3 is possibly the best handling bike I've ever ridden, and I don't say that lightly. First of all, it has this steel tubular frame combined with these aluminium swing-arm pivot plates for some added rigidity.
Then its triple spins backwards to reduce centripetal forces.
Those same forces produced by your wheel spinning are what allow a bike to balance upright.
It's like trying to change the angle of a spinning bicycle wheel. It's easy when it's stopped, but difficult when it's spinning.
So having the engine spin in the opposite direction to the wheels reduces those forces and makes it easier to turn the bike.
It's something MotoGP bikes take advantage of as well, and it makes a huge difference.
It can change direction so easily that occasionally the front wheel feels light, which is something I've never experienced on a sport bike before. All of this meant these weren't the only monkeys out on the road. The handlebars are also relatively close to the rider for a sport bike, which makes them very easy to tug on.
So the reach probably isn't great for bigger riders, but there is, however, plenty of leg room for taller riders.
So it managed to be super comfortable on longer rides too. There is obviously quite a bit of weight on your wrists, but not bad at all for a sport bike.
It might also just be an 800, but since it's a triple, it has a really good balance of torque and power.
I've ridden this engine before in the Turismo Veloci, but this is it turned up to 11. It makes 40 horsepower more at 147 and revs to 13,000 RPM, which almost gives it two personalities. You can ride it around just leveraging its torque lower down in the revs. But when you finally rev it out, it wakes up once again and screams like a supersport should.
It doesn't rip your face off like a liter bike, obviously, but it's still properly fast. I now see why this engine is infamous, and you can tell it's working hard, because even now when we're in the middle of winter here, you can still hear the fans coming on pretty frequently.
This is despite having an oil cooler in addition to a normal radiator.
What really bothers me is that it doesn't trust me enough to give me an actual coolant or oil temperature. All it will tell me is if it's hot or cold. The rest of the details are its own little secret for some reason.
Then Euro 5 has also ruined the sound of it with this stock exhaust, which allows you to hear how gritty the engine sounds. Unfortunately, it's not pleasant, but an aftermarket pipe would fix this in an instant.
So there's the first reason you should buy this bike. It's brilliant to ride. And here's the second reason.
Quite frankly, the F3 has looked pretty much identical since it was launched in 2012. And yet, 12 years later, it still looks incredible.
Yes, it is starting to look a smidge dated here in the headlight region, but the amount of attention this bike gets out on the road is overwhelming.
That red gives Ferrari a run for its money and brightens up the dull winter vegetation. The single-sided swing arm is as beautiful as ever, and I've always thought the tri-exit exhaust is the best looking stock exhaust.
Although it is comically long, I expected it to end about here, but it just keeps going.
It has mismatched seats with this crocodile leather texture, and I assume the red rear seat is supposed to look somewhat like a cowl.
There are also these strange gaps in the mirrors here that either deflect wind from the rider or offer an insane amount of downforce, or none of the above.
The fuse box is also really easy to access for some reason.
Not that you'd need it often on an MV, right? This is a 2022 base model, and apparently that doesn't get the nice daytime running light, and I really miss it. But my favorite Italian quirk has got to be the placement of the rear brake reservoir.
It makes it super easy for the engine to cook the brake fluid.
And this number plate bracket that is over-engineered. It's made of steel and feels sturdy enough for me to swing on. That is the last thing I'd expect them to make high quality. You may have noticed that I haven't said anything about the front brakes or suspension yet. That's because it's a bit of a confusing topic. So here's the problem I've been having. When you go to pull the front brake lever, it doesn't bite consistently in the same place. So that means that when the brakes are applied, it's a bit more abrupt than you were meaning to. Now obviously, when you pull the front brake lever, all of that weight shifts onto the front suspension, right? But these forks seem to dive a small amount before they start to absorb that load. So that abrupt dive and transfer of weight shocks the front tire, making braking kind of sketchy.
It has Marzocchi forks up front that are fully adjustable and a Sachs rear shock that is also fully adjustable with old-fashioned tools. So obviously I tinkered with the clickers to slow down the compression.
And that did help a bit, but it didn't eliminate the problem.
It should be said that it was only noticeable when riding around town, which is obviously not where this bike is best. Out on the flowing roads, it wasn't as noticeable, and the suspension transferred the tire's emotions nicely and soaked up all the racetrack-like bumps perfectly. So the next culprit to investigate had to be the brakes.
Up front, we have these big Brembo calipers, and let's be honest, my first thought was not to blame the Brembo calipers for the inconsistent lever feel.
So I went up to blame this Nissan master cylinder.
I mean, for almost 20 grand, you deserve a Brembo master cylinder, but I don't suppose this is the problem. After all, it's a radial pull master cylinder, and Nissan make great components.
But once there's pressure, there is more than enough braking power like you'd expect from this setup.
That points all fingers to the ABS pump then, which is located right here in this black box. Its job is to control brake pressure, which it doesn't seem to do very consistently.
It's frustrating because the bike corners magically, so you want to arrive at the corner confidently, not arguing with your ABS pump. And ironically, despite this, the ABS itself never bothered me, even though you can't switch it off completely. It's unobtrusive. It even lets the rear slide a bit, which I love.
If it was my bike, I would do an ABS delete and be a happy man. After all, that's the treatment that all track bikes get anyway. But it is a quirk, but it shouldn't detract from the genius of the rest of the bike. Everyone expects a ton of tech on bikes these days, which I guess is fair at this price. And the F3 has everything you could want.
To engage with all that tech, you get a 5.5-inch TFT display.
It's the same unit found on all current MVs and gets the job done.
Personally, I think it looks a tad cheap for an NV. You can't see the turn signal light in bright sun, it takes 20 minutes to boot up, and I don't like the cluttered layout. Although, it's a ton better than the Turismo Veloce because it has a lot less info to show you.
Overall, I'm glad it at least has a modern dash like this.
You then get these arrow buttons on the left grip to cycle through the menu, a launch and cruise control button on the right-hand grip, which do exactly that. Cruise control is a little finicky, but it is a nice feature, and probably won't get worn out on an F3. I gave launch control a try, which looked awesome, but I chickened out when I saw how high it was revving, and I felt sorry for the clutch already.
That's crazy.
But everyone needs a launch button in their lives. The quick shifter and blipper have their priority straight, focusing on fast shifting over smoothness, which I have no complaints about. It can also connect to the MV Ride app, which then lets you customize riding modes, keep track of past rides, and send turn-by-turn navigation to the dash, which is very handy. I learned a lot of new street names along the way. It offers 4 riding modes: Rain, Race, Sport, and Custom, of which Race and Sport feel about the same.
But you can change them while riding, which should be the norm on bikes.
There are 6 levels of lean-sensitive traction control, which isn't super important in a straight line on an 800, but can save your butt out of corners.
Bad traction control frustrates you, and good traction control makes you feel like a hero. Let's just say that I felt like I was drifting out of a corner when the TC stepped in on the F3, so make of that what you will.
And everyone loves a lean angle and G-meter. As usual, I took my girlfriend with me on my longer ride because I'm sure you're itching to know if you can tour the world on an F3 with your significant other.
And here are her findings. Easy to get onto, not windy, thin and hard seat, obviously, but comfortable position. But keep in mind she's short and small, so your mileage may vary.
But the original question was,
do the pros outweigh the quirks? They easily do. I know it sounds stupid, but in the case of the F3, I think quirks add to its character, as opposed to the Turismo Veloce, for example, that take away from the bike.
a sports tourer needs to ride across the country with no fuss. Whereas I'm happy to bleed the brakes, for example, before my Sunday ride on an F3. I'm happy to ride around its quirks on a twisty road. It's still fun.
Like I said, this was my unattainable dream bike when I was 19, but I ended up with an R6 for practicality reasons.
And now, having ridden one, I think 19-year-old me would be jealous. It tips you into a corner rather than the other way around. It has all the tech you could crave and looks beautiful. I honestly wish there were more sport bikes in this segment. There's more punch than a 600 and you don't have to rev the nuts off it, although feel free to. But it doesn't bite your head off like a 1000. It's a great combination that's slowly being forgotten. However, for a $19,000 800, it shouldn't have brake issues.
So let's try to think like an MV rider for just a second. Get into the mindset of an MV purchaser, investor, whatever you want to call them. Money is not an issue. I'm an MV rider, so I want an F3, I get an F3. But then it's not as special as I was expecting because I can't hear that gorgeous triple. But money's not an issue, so I go out and buy a full system Akrapovic. Problem solved. But then the brakes aren't that good and the suspension dives. But money's not an issue, so I do an ABS delete. And just like that, I have the perfect F3 that I've always wanted. If a problem can be overcome by money, it's not a problem for an MV rider. The only part that confuses me is that they offer an RR model as well, which you would assume fixes all of these issues with fancy electronic Öhlins suspension and a Brembo master cylinder. Except it doesn't. All you get for your extra money is some cool aero pieces. Nevertheless, 127 hours later, the F3 is back with its parents, so let's give it a score out of 60 to see where it lands on the board. After all, this is the first sport bike that's going to be on the board, and I love sport bikes. But currently, there's a 1390 Super Duke at the top. They say a beautiful design is timeless, and I think the F3 is proof of that. 9 out of 10. It's small and very easy to move around, but it does get hot, and the brakes and suspension don't enjoy town riding. 5 out of 10. It's hard not to enjoy its light handling in the twisties. 8. Yes, it is an MV, but you could also get something like Honda's new CBR 600RR that'll have much of the same technology for $6,000 less, so 4 out of 10. It's a decently quick little bike with usable power. You could easily keep up with liter bikes if you're a good rider. 7 out of 10. I won't even bother rating the stock exhaust, but if you look at the RR model with the Acra exhaust, it unlocks the sound of that triple. And then it sounds much more unique than an inline 4, but nowhere near a cross-plane V4 or even a V-twin. So another 7 out of 10.
Giving the F3 Rosso 40 out of 60. Which actually ties it with its long-lost cousin, the Turismo Veloce.
But let's be honest, if those two were side by side in a garage, I'm taking the F3 9 times out of 10. So it's going on top. But anyway, let me know if you would have the F3 in your collection, and I'll see you on the next ride.